Talk continues to swirl about eliminating the legislative filibuster here in the United States Senate. The Democrat leader has threatened that if Republicans don't vote the way he wants them to vote on legislation, eliminating the filibuster will be on the table. In an interview where he issued his threat, the Democrat leader made it very clear that he's not inviting Republicans to work with Democrats on legislation. This isn't an invitation for both parties to sit down at the table and arrive at an agreement that both parties can support. No, this is an invitation for Republicans to support exactly what Democrats want or face the consequences. And Mr. President, it's ironic that the Democrat leader would be taking that position today, because this is what he was saying back in 2017 about the legislative filibuster. This is the Democratic leader saying the legislative filibuster is the most important distinction between the Senate and the House. Let's find a way to further protect the 60-vote rule for legislation. So the Democratic leader was very supportive of this back in 2017 when they were using it extensively to try and stop or slow Republican legislation. The assistant Democratic leader, the Democratic whip, Senator Durbin from Illinois, said this in January 2018, "I can tell you that would be the end of the Senate as it was originally devised and created, going back to our founding fathers." Going back to our founding fathers, referencing the legislative filibuster and how important it was historically here in the United States Senate. Well, Mr. President, about that same time, 2017, 61 senators out of 100 here in the United States Senate, 61 out of 100 senators signed a letter in which they supported retention of the legislative filibuster. And in fact, it goes on to say that we are writing to urge you, and this is to the Senate leaders at the time, Senators McConnell and Schumer, to support our efforts to preserve existing rules, practices, and traditions as they pertain to the right of members to engage in extended debate on legislation before the United States Senate. Senators have expressed a variety of opinions about the appropriateness of limiting debate when we are considering judicial and executive branch nominations. Regardless of our past disagreements on that issue, we are united in our determination to preserve the ability of members to engage in extended debate when bills are on the Senate floor. 61 senators, including over 30 Democrats, Mr. President, on record as recently as 2017 in support of the legislative filibuster. Over 30 Democrat senators, including the Democratic leader and the Democratic whip. Well, what's changed? Because now they've done an abrupt reversal, complete 180. I mean, they're spinning around so fast it makes your eyes glaze over, Mr. President. What an incredible versatility of conviction they've demonstrated on this issue. And you think about the reason for it, what are they arguing? Well, they're saying the Republicans have been misusing the filibuster. Well, that's a little bit ironic given the fact the Republicans have been a majority for the past 6 years. Republicans took the majority in January of 2015 and held it until January of 2021. So the past 6 years, it's been the Democrats who were in the minority. They would be the ones exercising the legislative filibuster, and they used it extensively. They used it extensively last year to block legislation, repeatedly, over and over and over again. And Republicans at the time were under a lot of pressure to get rid of the legislative filibuster, including by the President of the United States, over and over and over, saying Republicans need to get rid of the legislative filibuster. Republicans, being consistent in their position, those who signed, of the 61 senators, Republicans who signed this letter, including me, have been consistent in our position even when we were in the majority, even when the Democrats were using the filibuster to block legislation that we were trying to advance, that we needed to maintain the filibuster because it was important to the institution of the Senate. and it required bipartisan cooperation. It required a level of comity to get legislation passed, and it made sure that the minority was represented in legislative solutions that were produced by the United States Senate. We've been consistent in that position, even when it meant taking on our administration, our president, over and over and over again. So the Democrats' argument now is that we have to get rid of the legislative filibuster because Republicans have been misusing it. How was that even possible? We were in the majority. The legislative filibuster is used, it's a tool used by the minority. It was used by the Democrats over and over and over again the past 6 years. But their argument now is that the Senate's not functioning, the Senate's not producing legislation? Really? Last year, Republicans were in the majority. We passed out of the Senate five coronavirus relief bills with huge bipartisan majorities. Huge bipartisan majorities, responding to the greatest crisis facing this country, both health crisis and economic crisis. We responded to it in a bipartisan way, honoring the rules and the traditions of the Senate, which were created by the founders to make the Senate a place unique in all the world, where the rights of the minority are honored, which require cooperation and working together to get results. And we produced results, in spite of the fact that Democrats consistently filibustered legislation. Now, there were certain pieces of legislation we didn't get passed. We didn't pass policing reform because Senator Tim Scott offered a piece of legislation that included all kinds of provisions that would have addressed that important issue for our country, and the Democrats filibustered over and over and over again. So we didn't get the 60 votes to get policing reform across the finish line. But, Mr. President, it is incredibly ironic. I mean, hypocrisy is not something that's unknown in politics. But hypocrisy on this level is unprecedented. The Democratic leader, the Democratic whip, over 30 Democrat senators have said as recently as 3 years ago, that we need to preserve the legislative filibuster because it's true to the tradition of the Senate and what the founders intended in terms of the role that the Senate was supposed to play in our democracy. And here we are, 2 or 3 years later, not because the Republicans had been misusing the filibuster, because the Republicans have been in the majority. We've been fending off the use of the filibuster by Democrats. They had no problems with the filibuster when they were using it as a tool at their disposal to block Republican initiatives. The first CARES bill, they filibustered multiple times, and it forced us to sit down with them and forge a compromise that in the end got 96 out of 100 votes in the United States Senate. But now the shoe's on the other foot. They're in the majority. And they've got all these things they want to get done, all this pent-up agenda. Now, what I would argue, Mr. President, is what's happening here is all the outside groups, all the left-wing groups that have all these things they want to get done, all of a sudden have concluded that notwithstanding their use of the filibuster to block Republicans from accomplishing their agenda for the past 6 years, now that the shoe's on the other foot and we're in the majority and we've got power, we're going to do away with over 200 years of history. 200 years of history that was put in place by the founders to require the United States Senate to be different than the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives does everything by simple majority. They have a rules committee. I served for 3 terms there. They have a rules committee that prescribes basically what legislation can come to the floor, what amendments are made in order, how much time is allowed for debate on each amendment. Everything is very structured, it's very organized. It's all done by Democratic rule, majority rule, simple majority rule. The Senate was created to operate differently, Mr. President, by the founders. And here we are, having a debate about whether or not we are going to honor that tradition, that heritage, that legacy, that vision that the founders had when it came to how the United States Senate should operate. Mr. President, earlier this month, one Democrat senator suggested that we should get rid of the filibuster because it's, quote, undemocratic. Undemocratic. In other words, it prevents the majority from doing everything it wants to do. But as I said on the floor last week, Mr. President, letting the majority do everything it wants to is not what the founders had in mind. The founders recognized that it wasn't just kings who could be tyrants. They knew majorities could be tyrants, too, and that a majority, if unchecked, could trample the rights of the minority. And so the founders combined majority rule with both representation and constitutional protection for the minority. They established safeguards, checks and balances throughout our government to keep the government in check and ensure that the rights of the minority were protected. And one of those safeguards was the Senate. In the House of Representatives, as I said, majority rule is emphasized, and the founders could have left it at that. They could have stuck with a single legislative body, but they didn't. Why? Because they were worried about the possibility of tyrannical majorities in the House endangering the rights of the minority. Mr. President, the author of Federalist 62 notes, and I quote, "A Senate, as a second branch of the Legislative Assembly, distinct from and dividing the power with a first, must be in all cases a salutary check on the government. It doubles the security to the people by requiring the concurrence of two distinct bodies in schemes of usurpation or perfidy. Secondly, the necessity of a Senate is not less indicated by the propensity of all single and numerous assemblies to yield to the impulse of sudden and violent passions and to be seduced by factious leaders into intemperate and pernicious resolutions," end quote. That's from Federalist number 62. And so the founders, Mr. President, created the Senate as a check on the House of Representatives. They made the Senate smaller and senators' terms of office longer with the intention of creating a more stable, more thoughtful, and more deliberative legislative body to check ill-considered or intemperate legislation and attempts to curtail minority rights. And as time has gone on, the legislative filibuster has become perhaps the key way the Senate protects minority rights. The filibuster ensures that the minority party has a voice in the Senate. It forces compromise. It forces bipartisanship. Even in the now rare case when a majority party has a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, the filibuster still forces the majority party to take into account the views of its more moderate or middle-of-the-road members, thus ensuring that more Americans are represented in legislation. People tend to focus on the fact that the filibuster protects the country from any one party's most extreme legislation, but the truth is, Mr. President, the filibuster is probably the biggest reason that any bill in the Senate is ever bipartisan. Routine spending bills, farm bills, defense authorization bills, the main reason many of these bills are ever bipartisan outside of divided government is because the filibuster forces the parties to compromise. Don't believe me? Just look at how the House has handled these bills in recent years. Mr. President, Democrats were eager to take advantage of the filibuster's protection for minority rights when they were in the minority, but now that they're in the majority, they don't want anything standing in their way. They don't want to have compromise. They don't want to have to consider the Americans who didn't vote for a Democrat agenda. They want to do whatever they want, whenever they want it. Mr. President, Democrats' disregard for minority rights would be troubling even if they had a substantial majority in the Senate. The voice of the minority deserves to be heard, even when the minority is substantially outnumbered. But it's particularly outrageous that Democrats are so determined to sweep away protections for minority rights when they barely have a majority in the Senate and certainly don't have a mandate. In fact, Democrats don't have a real majority at all, only a technical one. The Senate is divided 50-50. The only reason Democrats have a deciding vote in the Senate is because the Vice President is a Democrat. In the House, Democrats' majority narrowed substantially in the November election. And as for the presidency, while certainly a Democrat won the election, it's worth noting that the only candidate who could win the Democrat primary was a man historically regarded as a moderate. Even among Democrats, far left liberal candidates did not fare so well. So, Mr. President, if there was any mandate in the election, it was a mandate for moderation. It was a mandate for compromise, for pulling the country together. The Democrats are running away from unity and bipartisanship as fast as they can. They're determined to leverage their weak victory into the implementation of a partisan, far-left agenda. Mr. President, there are two bills that have driven the conversation around eliminating the filibuster in recent weeks. They're H.R. 1, an election bill, and H.R. 5, the so-called Equality Act. The first bill is a truly outrageous power grab, an attempt to federalize election law and eliminate protections for election integrity. Democrats have discarded years of important bipartisan work on election security and integrity in order to permanently boost Democrats' chances of winning majorities. The second, the so-called Equality Act, is an unprecedented attack on the First Amendment that would substantially restrict the rights of Americans to live by their faith. And these are the bills that Democrats think should be shoved through by the narrowest of majorities. Mr. President, there have been suggestions that eliminating the filibuster is the cure for partisanship and gridlock in the Senate. Well, it might be the cure for gridlock in the sense that the majority could steamroll through whatever it wanted, whenever it wanted. But you don't cure partisanship by making it easier for the majority to be partisan. Eliminating the filibuster isn't going to eliminate partisanship, it's going to heighten it. Take away the filibuster and the majority party has zero reason, zero, to take into account the views of the minority. What eliminating the filibuster will do is ensure that one party has no voice at all in the United States Senate, no matter how many Americans that party represents. A couple of weeks ago, we got a preview of what life would look like in the filibuster-less Senate when Democrats passed their so-called COVID bill under the simple majority rules of reconciliation. There wasn't a lot of gridlock, since reconciliation allowed Senate Democrats to force their bill through, but there was plenty of partisanship. Democrats made it very clear that while Republicans were welcome to vote for their bill, Republican ideas were not welcome at the table. Democrats knew that they didn't need Republicans to pass their legislation, which empowered them to completely reject Republican input in drafting the bill and to load the bill with Democrat priorities, from a bailout for union pensions to a state slush fund heavily weighted in favor of blue states to the omission of long-standing federal restrictions on using taxpayer dollars to pay for abortions. It was quite a contrast to the 5 bipartisan COVID bills passed under the filibuster rule in a Republican-led Senate, which were focused on fighting the virus rather than shoving through partisan priorities. Mr. President, while their recent narrow majority has seemingly erased all memory of their minority status over the last few years, I encourage my Democrat colleagues to remember just how much they valued the legislative filibuster during their time in the minority, and how bitterly they regretted eliminating the judicial filibuster once President Trump became the beneficiary. While Democrats might like to think that their time in power will last forever, it is a truth of American politics that sooner or later, no matter how powerful your majority, you end up in the minority again. I encourage my colleagues to think about that time when they will be in the minority again and to ask themselves whether they really want to eliminate their voices and the voices of their constituents in future policy battles. Mr. President, I yield the floor.